On a crisp Tuesday morning in October 1957, Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell adjusted her wire-rimmed spectacles and placed a beginner's exercise book on the polished mahogany music stand in her Georgetown townhouse, preparing for her 10 o'clock student with the same meticulous attention she brought to every lesson. The autumn light filtered through delicate lace curtains onto the Steinway grand piano that dominated her modest parlor, where the faint scent of lemon polish mingled with the aroma of Earl Grey tea brewing in her kitchen, creating an atmosphere of refined domesticity that had made her one of Washington's most sought-after piano instructors. Outside her window, the maple trees lining the cobblestone street had begun their transformation into brilliant shades of crimson and gold, and the distant sound of traffic on M Street provided a subtle backdrop to the peaceful morning. Her parlor walls were adorned with framed photographs of past students at recitals, certificates from music competitions, and a reproduction of a Renoir painting showing a young woman at a piano. Everything about the room spoke of respectability, tradition, and harmless artistic pursuit. What the mothers who delivered their children to her doorstep each week could never have imagined was that this 53-year-old spinster with her sensible shoes, perfect posture, and gentle manner was orchestrating the most successful Soviet intelligence operation ever conducted on American soil. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Margaret had not always been a spy. Born in Philadelphia in 1904 to German immigrants who ran a successful bakery on 2nd Street, she had shown exceptional musical talent from an early age, earning a full scholarship to the prestigious Peabody Conservatory in Baltimore when she was just 16 years old. Her father, Klaus Hartmann, had anglicized the family name to Hartwell during the First World War, when anti-German sentiment made business difficult and sometimes dangerous, and young Margaret had absorbed his crucial lesson about adaptation and concealment, about the necessity of hiding one's true nature to survive in a hostile world. She graduated with honors in 1924, her slender fingers capable of coaxing extraordinary beauty from the piano, drawing tears from audiences with her interpretation of Rachmaninoff and standing ovations for her performance of Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody. For several years, she performed in recitals throughout the mid-Atlantic states, her name appearing in society pages and music reviews, earning modest but genuine recognition in classical music circles. Critics praised her technical precision and emotional depth, noting that she brought an unusual intensity to everything she played, as if channeling something profound and unexpressed through the music. But the Great Depression shattered her performing career along with so many other dreams. Concert halls closed their doors, wealthy patrons who had sponsored recitals disappeared or withdrew their support, and by 1932, Margaret found herself giving lessons to restless children in Baltimore for 50 cents an hour, struggling to pay rent on a tiny apartment above a butcher shop. The contrast between her dreams and her reality became almost unbearable. She had trained for years to bring beauty into the world through music, and now she spent her days teaching simple scales to children who would rather be playing outside. It was during this difficult period of disappointment and financial struggle that she met David Goldstein, a very passionate young law student at Johns Hopkins University, who attended the same workers' education lectures she had started frequenting at the Labor Hall on Fayette Street. David opened her eyes to the vast inequalities of American society, the suffering of working people, and the promise of a different system that valued human beings over profit. When David introduced her to others who shared these convictions, Margaret felt she had finally found her purpose. The Communist Party USA operated openly in Baltimore during those years, organizing strikes and protests, distributing literature, and recruiting idealistic young people who believed in creating a more just world. Margaret joined in 1933, and for several years she attended meetings, distributed pamphlets, and genuinely believed she was working toward a better future for ordinary Americans. She never imagined that this commitment would eventually transform her into something far more dangerous than a political activist. In 1938, Margaret was approached by a man who identified himself only as Victor. He was older, perhaps 50, with a slight accent she could not quite place and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything with cold calculation. They met in a quiet corner of the Enoch Pratt Free Library, surrounded by dusty books on philosophy and history, where their conversation would seem like nothing more than scholarly discussion if anyone happened to overhear. Victor told her that people of conviction like herself could serve the cause in more meaningful ways than attending meetings and handing out leaflets on street corners. The Soviet Union, he explained in measured tones, faced encirclement by capitalist powers bent on its destruction, and it needed friends in America who could provide information that would help protect the workers' paradise from those who wished to crush it before it could demonstrate the superiority of socialism to the world. Margaret hesitated only briefly, wrestling with the magnitude of what he was proposing. The Munich Agreement had just betrayed Czechoslovakia to Hitler, demonstrating that the Western democracies were willing to appease fascism rather than stand against it. And it seemed increasingly clear to her that the Soviet Union was the only power willing to genuinely confront Nazi Germany. If helping the Soviet Union meant protecting the one nation actually fighting for a better world, then it seemed not just acceptable but morally imperative. Victor started her with small tasks designed to test her reliability and nerve. She would meet certain people at specified locations, a bench in Druid Hill Park or a particular table at a downtown cafeteria, exchange a few words using prescribed phrases, and pass along sealed envelopes tucked inside newspapers or magazines. She never knew what information the envelopes contained, and Victor encouraged her not to ask unnecessary questions, to maintain compartmentalization and operational security. Gradually, as she proved reliable and capable, Victor taught her basic tradecraft through patient instruction and practical exercises. How to detect surveillance by watching for repeated faces or vehicles, how to use dead drops in parks and public buildings, how to communicate through seemingly innocent personal advertisements in newspapers using simple code systems, how to memorize information and destroy evidence. Margaret discovered she had a natural aptitude for the work that surprised even Victor. Her years of musical training had developed an extraordinary attention to detail and timing, an ability to notice small variations in patterns and rhythms that most people would miss. Her unremarkable appearance and quiet demeanor made her virtually invisible in crowds, someone people's eyes would pass over without registering. Who would suspect a spinster piano teacher of anything more subversive than perhaps voting for the wrong candidate or subscribing to liberal magazines? When the Second World War began, and the Soviet Union became America's ally after the German invasion in 1941, Margaret felt vindicated. For a brief period, her dual loyalties seemed perfectly aligned. She volunteered for war work, teaching piano to wounded servicemen at military hospitals and organizing bond drives, all while continuing to perform occasional tasks for Victor. But she understood that the alliance was temporary, born of necessity rather than genuine trust, and when the war ended, the real work would begin. In 1946, Victor told her it was time to move to Washington. The nation's capital was swelling with government workers, military personnel, diplomats, intelligence officers, and defense contractors, all part of the massive bureaucratic and military apparatus that would define the emerging Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union. Margaret needed to establish herself there, create the perfect cover identity that would allow her to move in the right circles and prepare for her real mission. Victor arranged for her to purchase the 3-story Georgetown townhouse through a front company that listed its address as a law office in Delaware, and she opened her piano teaching studio that autumn, advertising in the Washington Post and the Evening Star, distributing flyers at music shops and schools, and offering her services at competitive rates that appealed to middle-class families. Georgetown in the late 1940s was an enclave of power and influence, home to senior diplomats, ranking government officials, military officers with Pentagon assignments, and the well-connected lawyers and lobbyists who served them. The neighborhood's tree-lined streets and federal-style townhouses represented old money and new power, tradition and ambition intertwined. These were precisely the people whose children needed piano lessons, whose wives attended garden club meetings and charity luncheons, whose dinner conversations touched on classified information and policy debates. Margaret quickly built a thriving practice by being everything a good piano teacher should be: punctual, proper, musically knowledgeable, demanding but never cruel with students, and charging reasonable rates that seemed fair rather than exploitative. Within 2 years, she was teaching nearly 40 students each week, her calendar filled from early morning until evening with half-hour and hour-long lessons. Their mothers would often stay to chat during lessons, gathering in Margaret's small kitchen over tea and cookies, sharing the latest Washington gossip about which ambassador was being reassigned, which senator was having marital difficulties, which defense contractor had won which contract. What made Margaret truly exceptional as an intelligence operative was not merely her perfect cover or her technical skills in tradecraft. It was her profound understanding of human nature and her ability to identify, cultivate and recruit assets without them ever realizing they had been targeted. The spy ring she built did not consist of ideological communists or paid informants who might eventually crack under FBI pressure. Instead, it comprised lonely people seeking friendship, ambitious people seeking validation, and troubled people seeking help, all of whom came to trust the kind piano teacher who took such genuine interest in their lives. Her first major recruitment was Thomas Brennan, whom she met in 1948 at a church social. Thomas worked as a file clerk at the State Department, a 40-year-old bachelor who still lived with his elderly mother, and collected stamps as a hobby. He was the sort of person who became invisible in any room, overlooked by colleagues and ignored by potential romantic partners. Margaret befriended him slowly, attending the same stamp-collecting club meetings, inviting him to tea, listening with apparent fascination to his detailed descriptions of rare postal issues from obscure countries. She never asked him about his work directly, but Thomas, starved for attention and connection, began telling her things anyway, sharing frustrations about his demanding supervisors and boring assignments. Over months, Margaret gently encouraged Thomas to bring home documents he was processing, telling him she found government work fascinating and would love to understand what he did all day. Thomas, thrilled that someone finally cared, began bringing files home in his briefcase. Margaret would study them during his visits, making handwritten notes while he sat in her parlor, drinking tea and eating cookies, never realizing that her questions about technical details were anything more than polite curiosity. The documents Thomas provided gave Soviet intelligence valuable insights into State Department communications procedures, code clerk rotations, and security protocols. Margaret never paid Thomas. She never revealed that she was passing his information to anyone. She simply provided him with something far more valuable than money, the attention and appreciation he desperately craved. When the FBI eventually investigated the leaks Thomas had caused, they never connected them to the unremarkable piano teacher he sometimes visited for tea. Her second recruitment was more sophisticated. Catherine Morrison was the 28-year-old wife of a Navy lieutenant commander stationed at the Pentagon. Catherine had studied piano seriously in college and came to Margaret in 1949 for advanced lessons, hoping to maintain her skills. She was talented, educated, and deeply unhappy in her marriage to James Morrison, a man 12 years her senior who spent his evenings drinking scotch and complaining about his career stagnation. Margaret recognized Catherine's unhappiness immediately and became her confidant. During breaks between exercises and sonatas, Catherine would share her frustrations, her loneliness, her sense that life was passing her by in a loveless marriage to a man who barely noticed her existence. Margaret listened with empathy, offering gentle advice and creating a space where Catherine felt truly seen. She never suggested that Catherine divorce James. Instead, she subtly encouraged Catherine to find purpose and meaning in her own life, to develop her own interests and relationships separate from her husband. What made this particularly valuable was that James Morrison, despite his drinking and his unhappy marriage, had access to classified information about naval operations in the Atlantic. He brought work home sometimes, spreading files across the dining room table while Catherine practiced piano in the next room. Margaret, during one of their tea sessions, casually mentioned that she found military strategy fascinating, having read several books about naval history. Catherine, eager to share something that might interest her mentor, began describing things her husband worked on, repeating details she had overheard or glimpsed. Margaret never asked Catherine to spy. She never suggested that Catherine photograph documents or steal files. She simply listened with interest when Catherine talked, asked thoughtful questions, and remembered every detail. The information Catherine provided unknowingly, thinking she was just making conversation with a trusted friend, helped Soviet naval intelligence understand American submarine deployment patterns and anti-submarine warfare tactics. By 1952, Margaret's network included 7 people who regularly provided her with classified or sensitive information, none of whom understood they were part of an espionage operation. There was Helen Kirkpatrick, a secretary at the newly established Central Intelligence Agency, who was going through a painful divorce from a husband who had been unfaithful with multiple women. Helen found solace in Margaret's kindness and understanding, in the weekly tea sessions where someone actually listened to her pain without judgment. Through Helen's unconscious disclosures about office procedures and security weaknesses, Margaret learned valuable details about CIA operational methods. There was Robert Chen, a brilliant Chinese-American researcher at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, who faced constant discrimination from colleagues who questioned his loyalty despite his American birth and distinguished academic record. He appreciated Margaret's seemingly colorblind friendship, her genuine interest in his work on radar systems, her willingness to treat him as a complete human being rather than a suspected enemy. There was Patricia Hoffman, whose son Mark took piano lessons every Wednesday afternoon, and who worked as a senior accountant at Lockheed Martin, processing invoices and budget documents that revealed details about classified weapons development programs. Patricia saw Margaret as a cultured friend who understood her frustrations about being an educated woman stuck in a subordinate position because of her gender. There was Lieutenant Commander William Bradley, a Navy intelligence officer who attended the same Episcopal church as Margaret, and whose wife Sarah had died of cancer the previous year, leaving him raising 2 young daughters alone. Margaret helped him by occasionally babysitting the girls, offering them free piano lessons, and providing the kind of feminine perspective on parenting that he desperately needed. In gratitude and loneliness, William shared more than he should have about Soviet submarine movements and naval intelligence assessments. Margaret's method was always the same: identify isolation, provide connection, build trust, and allow information to flow naturally through what appeared to be ordinary friendship. She never pushed, never asked direct questions about classified material, and never paid anyone. The relationship seemed entirely genuine because, in a certain sense, they were. Margaret did care about these people. She listened to their problems, remembered their birthdays, and provided emotional support. The fact that she was simultaneously exploiting their trust and feeding their secrets to Soviet intelligence did not, in her own mind, diminish the authenticity of her affection. She communicated with her handlers through an elaborate system that had been refined over years. On the second Tuesday of each month, Margaret would visit the main branch of the public library and place a yellow bookmark in a specific encyclopedia volume to signal that she had material to pass. 3 days later, she would attend an afternoon concert at the National Gallery of Art, carrying a distinctive red umbrella regardless of weather. Her handler would sit 3 rows behind her, and during intermission, they would exchange identical shopping bags in the crowded bathroom, each containing different contents. Margaret's bag would include microfilm documents, handwritten intelligence reports and assessments of her sources. The handler's bag would contain money for Margaret's expenses, instructions for future operations, and occasionally technical equipment like miniature cameras or special paper for invisible writing. The system worked flawlessly for years because Margaret followed every protocol precisely, never deviated from established procedures, and maintained perfect operational security. She never mentioned her secret life to anyone, never kept incriminating materials in her home longer than necessary, and never contacted her handlers except through established channels. Her piano teaching provided legitimate income that explained her comfortable lifestyle. And her social calendar was filled with innocuous activities: church services, garden club meetings, concert attendance, charitable work. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a respectable middle-aged woman living a quiet life, which made her the perfect spy. The only person who ever suspected something was unusual about Margaret was an 8-year-old piano student named Emily Crawford, who came for lessons every Thursday afternoon starting in 1953. Emily was a bright, observant child with an active imagination, fueled by the Nancy Drew mysteries she devoured, and she noticed things that adults overlooked or dismissed as unimportant. She noticed that Margaret sometimes had faint smudges of what looked like photographic developer ink on her fingers, even though she claimed never to write anything except music notation and never mentioned photography as a hobby. She noticed that Margaret would sometimes become very still when certain topics came up in conversation, particularly anything related to government work or military matters, as if listening extremely carefully while pretending casual interest. She noticed that Margaret's basement door was always locked with a heavy deadbolt, which seemed odd for someone who lived alone and had nothing supposedly to hide. She noticed that on certain days, Margaret would glance at the clock repeatedly during lessons and sometimes cut them short by exactly 5 or 10 minutes, always with apologetic explanations about other appointments. Emily found these small inconsistencies fascinating in the way that only a child paying close attention could, though she had no framework for understanding what they might actually mean. One Thursday in November 1954, Emily arrived 15 minutes early for her lesson and found Margaret not yet home. The housekeeper, an elderly woman named Mrs. Murphy who came twice a week, let Emily in and told her to wait in the parlor. But Emily, curious and bored, wandered toward the kitchen and happened to glance out the back window in time to see Margaret emerging from the alley behind the townhouse, adjusting her coat and looking around carefully before entering through the back door. It was odd because Margaret always came through the front door, and Emily wondered why she had been in the alley. Emily never mentioned what she had seen, but she began paying closer attention during her lessons. She noticed that on certain days, Margaret seemed distracted, checking her watch frequently and cutting lessons short by 5 or 10 minutes. She noticed that Margaret sometimes received telephone calls that she would take in the hallway, speaking in a voice too low to hear clearly. None of this proved anything, of course, and Emily's mother dismissed her observations as the overactive imagination of a child who read too many mystery novels. But Emily was right to sense that something was not quite ordinary about her piano teacher. In the spring of 1955, Margaret's operation nearly came undone because of a mistake she had not made. One of her sources, Thomas Brennan, the lonely stamp collector from the State Department, had apparently been providing information to another Soviet operative as well, someone far less skilled than Margaret. The FBI had detected this other operation through radio intercepts, and when they arrested the handler, Thomas panicked and attempted to flee to Mexico. He was caught at the border and under interrogation began naming everyone he had ever discussed government work with, including Margaret. When FBI agents knocked on Margaret's door on a Monday morning in June 1955, she had already been warned through an emergency signal from her handlers. She had spent the previous 48 hours destroying every piece of incriminating evidence in her home, burning documents in her fireplace, dissolving microfilm in acid, and disposing of her special camera by dropping it into the Potomac River during an early morning walk. By the time the agents arrived, there was nothing in her townhouse except piano music, teaching materials, and the thoroughly ordinary possessions of a middle-aged piano teacher. The interview was conducted in her parlor by 2 agents, one young and aggressive, the other older and more measured. Margaret offered them tea, answered their questions politely, and expressed shock that Thomas Brennan could have been involved in espionage. Yes, she knew Thomas from church and stamp collecting, and yes, he had visited her home occasionally for tea, but they had never discussed his work in any detail. She had assumed he worked in some mundane clerical position and had never asked for specifics. The agents questioned her for 3 hours, going over the same ground repeatedly, but Margaret never wavered or contradicted herself. She was calm, cooperative, and completely credible. What saved Margaret was the very ordinariness of her cover. The FBI agents could not imagine that this prim piano teacher who served them tea in china cups and spoke earnestly about the importance of classical music education could possibly be a sophisticated intelligence operative. Thomas Brennan, under interrogation, insisted that he had never given Margaret classified documents or discussed specific government secrets, which was technically true. He had simply shown her files and talked about his work while she listened and asked innocent questions. The FBI found no evidence of payment, no suspicious bank deposits, no coded messages, and no pattern of behavior that suggested espionage. After 3 weeks of investigation, they concluded that Margaret was exactly what she appeared to be, an unwitting dupe who had befriended a lonely man without realizing he was a security risk. Margaret's handlers, however, decided the risk was too great. They ordered her to cease all intelligence activities immediately and maintain her cover while they evaluated whether the FBI investigation might expand. For 8 months, Margaret simply taught piano, attended church, and lived the life she had been pretending to live for years. The irony was not lost on her. The role she had played as cover had become her reality, at least temporarily. During this period of forced inactivity, Margaret began to experience something she had not allowed herself to feel in years: profound doubt about the life she had chosen and the person she had become. Without the purpose and excitement of her secret work, without the sense of serving a greater cause, she was confronted with what her life had actually become in stark and undeniable terms. She was 51 years old, unmarried, childless, living in a house filled with photographs of other people's children, with no close friends she could truly trust, because every relationship in her life was built on layers of deception. The students she taught with such apparent care would grow up and forget her, just another piano teacher from their childhood. The people she had recruited, manipulated and betrayed would never know what she had done to them, how she had violated their trust for purposes they would find abhorrent. When she died, there would be no recognition of her service, no acknowledgement of her sacrifice, just a small obituary in the Washington Post, noting that Margaret Hartwell, piano teacher, had passed away at whatever age, survived by no one in particular. She thought about David Goldstein, the idealistic young law student who had introduced her to the Communist Party 23 years earlier, back when she still believed that political activism could change the world through open persuasion rather than secret manipulation. She had lost touch with David during the war years, but she had heard through old Baltimore contacts that he had become profoundly disillusioned with Soviet communism after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact revealed Stalin's willingness to ally with Hitler, and had eventually drifted away from radical politics entirely, unable to reconcile his ideals with the brutal realities of what the Soviet Union actually did. David had moved on with his life, built a successful law practice, married a woman he loved, had 3 children who apparently adored him. Margaret wondered if he had made the wiser choice, if her commitment to the cause had been nothing more than a way to give meaning to a life that otherwise lacked it, if she had sacrificed authentic human connection for the illusion of importance in secret work that no one would ever know about or care about. But in April 1956, her handlers reactivated her with a new assignment that was both more ambitious and more dangerous than anything she had done before. The Soviet Union wanted detailed information about American missile development programs, particularly the emerging intercontinental ballistic missile projects that could deliver nuclear warheads to Soviet cities. Margaret's existing network did not have access to this information, which meant she would need to recruit new sources, and the kind of people who worked on missile programs were far more security conscious than file clerks and secretaries. Her opportunity came through an unexpected connection. One of her piano students, 12-year-old Susan Hoffman, had an older brother named David, who was a graduate student in aerospace engineering at the University of Maryland. David was brilliant, ambitious, and frustrated that his German-Jewish background seemed to limit his opportunities in a field still dominated by former Nazi scientists brought to America under Operation Paperclip. Margaret met David when he came to pick up his sister from a lesson, and she immediately recognized his resentment and vulnerability. She cultivated David slowly and carefully over many months, beginning with conversations about music and his studies, gradually moving to deeper discussions about fairness, justice, and the ironies of German rocket scientists who had built weapons for Hitler, now working for American democracy. Margaret never raised politics directly, but she asked questions that encouraged David to articulate his own frustrations and doubts. When David began his first real job at a defense contractor, Working on guidance systems for military missiles, Margaret had already established herself as a trusted mentor figure, someone who understood his complicated feelings about contributing to weapons development. The recruitment itself happened almost imperceptibly. David, troubled by certain ethical implications of his work, mentioned during one of their conversations that he was helping develop targeting systems that could guide nuclear missiles to specific cities. Margaret listened with concern and asked thoughtful questions about whether such weapons made the world safer or more dangerous. David, working through his own moral confusion, began bringing Margaret technical documents to discuss, not because she asked for them, but because he needed someone to help him think through what he was doing. Margaret photographed these documents with a miniature camera concealed in a hollowed-out book, developing the film in her basement darkroom, using techniques her handlers had taught her years earlier. The intelligence David unknowingly provided was extraordinarily valuable, giving Soviet missile designers insights into American guidance technology that would save them years of development time. By 1957, the year our story opened, Margaret was running the most productive Soviet intelligence network in Washington, providing regular streams of classified information on military technology, diplomatic communications, and strategic planning. She had 11 active sources, none of whom knew they were being exploited, all of whom trusted her completely. She had survived FBI investigation, refined her tradecraft to near perfection, and served the cause she believed in with remarkable success. But the foundation of her operation rested on a fundamental deception that was far more fragile than she realized. Every relationship she had built was based on lies. Every friendship was instrumentalized. Every confidence shared with her was betrayed. She had become so skilled at manipulation that she had perhaps forgotten how to relate to another human being authentically. The unraveling began not with a counterintelligence breakthrough, but with a simple human moment. In October 1957, the same month our story began, Margaret received devastating news. Her brother, her only remaining family member, had died suddenly of a heart attack in Philadelphia. He had been 60 years old, married with 3 grown children who barely knew their aunt. Margaret traveled to Philadelphia for the funeral, where her nieces and nephews greeted her politely but distantly, this strange woman who sent birthday cards, but had never really been part of their lives. At the funeral reception, Margaret overheard her oldest niece say to her sister that it was sad how Aunt Margaret had never married or had children, how she had lived such a small, lonely life. The comment, not meant to be cruel but simply observational, cut through Margaret's carefully constructed self-image. She realized that from the outside, her life looked exactly as empty as it actually was. The work she did, the work she believed was important and meaningful, was invisible and would always remain so. She had sacrificed ordinary human connection for a cause that could never acknowledge her sacrifice. Returning to Washington, Margaret found herself questioning for the first time whether her life's work had been worth the price. She looked at her piano students differently, seeing not potential intelligence assets or useful connections, but actual children whose innocence she was exploiting by using them to access their parents. She thought about Catherine Morrison, the unhappy Navy wife whose confidences she had betrayed, and Robert Chen, the discriminated against researcher who had found in her the colorblind friend he desperately needed, never knowing she was using his trust to steal secrets. The doubt grew deeper when in November 1957, the Soviet Union brutally suppressed the Hungarian uprising, sending tanks to crush a popular rebellion against communist rule. Margaret read newspaper accounts of Soviet soldiers firing on Hungarian workers and students, the very people the communist system was supposed to liberate and protect. She thought about the arguments she had made to herself over the years, that she was serving the cause of peace and justice, protecting the Soviet Union from capitalist aggression. But watching tanks crush protesters in Budapest, she wondered if she had been lying to herself all along. Her crisis of conscience deepened further when she learned through her intelligence network that the Soviet Union was planning to position nuclear missiles in Cuba, directly threatening American cities with the same kind of weapons she had been helping them develop. The information came from a source she had cultivated at the State Department, and Margaret dutifully photographed and passed along the intelligence. But for the first time she felt sick doing it, The abstract geopolitical struggle she had believed she was supporting suddenly became terrifyingly concrete. If war came, the missiles she had helped the Soviets improve might incinerate millions of Americans, including her students, her sources, everyone she knew. In December 1957, Margaret made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just months earlier. She requested an emergency meeting with her handler, using a signal she had been told to use only in case of immediate danger. They met in a safe house in Baltimore, and Margaret told her handler that she wanted out. She was exhausted, she said, and the FBI investigation had shaken her more than she had admitted. She wanted to retire from active operations and live out her remaining years quietly teaching piano. Her handler, a man she knew only as Sergei, refused. Margaret, he explained, was far too valuable to lose, and she knew far too much to be allowed to simply walk away. The operation would continue, and she would continue running it. If she refused or attempted to defect, measures would be taken to ensure her silence. Sergei did not specify what those measures might be, but his meaning was clear enough. Margaret returned to Washington terrified and trapped. She had built a prison for herself out of lies and betrayals, and now she could not escape it. She continued running her network mechanically, passing information to her handlers, recruiting new sources when opportunities arose, but the sense of purpose that had sustained her for 20 years was gone. She was going through the motions, a spy who no longer believed in her mission, but could not stop without destroying herself. The resolution came in a way she never expected. In February 1958, one of Margaret's students, 16-year-old Jennifer Hamilton, confided during a lesson that her father, a colonel in the army, was acting strangely, drinking heavily and staying up late burning papers in their fireplace. Margaret recognized the signs immediately. The colonel was probably under investigation or preparing to defect. She knew she should report this information to her handlers, that it might be valuable intelligence. But instead, she found herself giving Jennifer advice that came from genuine concern rather than operational calculation. She suggested that Jennifer talk to her mother, that the family might need to pull together during a difficult time, that sometimes adults go through challenges that children cannot fully understand. 2 weeks later, Colonel Hamilton turned himself into Army counterintelligence, confessing that he had been passing classified information to Soviet intelligence for 3 years. His confession led to the exposure of his handler and the unraveling of an entire espionage network. Margaret followed the news with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Colonel Hamilton would go to prison, his family would be destroyed, but at least the damage would stop. That night, Margaret sat at her piano and played for the first time in months, not teaching or practicing, but simply playing for herself. She played Chopin's Nocturnes, Beethoven's Pathétique Sonata, pieces she had learned as a young woman before her life took the path that had led her to this moment. The music filled her townhouse, and for those hours, she was not a spy or a teacher or anything, except a woman playing piano, expressing through music the emotions she could not speak aloud. The next morning, Margaret sat down at her Remington typewriter, the same machine she had used for years to type innocent-looking letters and shopping lists that contained coded messages. The letter was addressed to the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and began with 5 simple words that she knew would irrevocably change everything. "I am a Soviet spy." She detailed her entire operation with the same meticulous attention to accuracy that had made her such an effective intelligence operative, naming her handlers by their operational names and physical descriptions, describing her methods of recruitment and communication in comprehensive detail, identifying her sources by their full names and positions, and explaining the specific intelligence she had passed to Soviet controllers over 20 years of espionage work. She wrote for 6 hours straight, her fingers striking the keys with steady rhythm, producing a 30-page single-spaced confession that laid out one of the most successful and damaging espionage operations in Cold War history. She included details that only someone with genuine inside knowledge could provide, information that would prove beyond any doubt that her confession was authentic and not some attention-seeking fabrication. When she finished typing the final page and rolled it from the typewriter, she placed the document in a manila envelope addressed it in careful block letters, affixed the proper postage, and put it in her leather purse. But Margaret did not mail the letter that day. Not yet. First, she had to warn the people she had betrayed, the lonely and vulnerable people she had cultivated and manipulated into providing her with secrets, the people whose trust she had violated for what she had believed was a higher purpose. Over the next 3 days, she made a series of careful visits, appearing at their homes or offices with plausible excuses, telling each of her sources that they needed to be much more careful about what they discussed with casual acquaintances, that she had heard through church contacts that the FBI was intensifying its counterintelligence efforts and cracking down on loose talk about sensitive matters, that they should perhaps speak with their security officers about proper handling of classified information and review their clearance paperwork. She never admitted what she had done to them, never explicitly revealed her role in their compromises, never asked for their forgiveness, but she gave each of them a fighting chance to protect themselves, to get their stories straight, to prepare for what was coming, before she turned herself in and destroyed all their lives along with her own. On March 14, 1958, Margaret mailed her confession to the FBI. Then she went home, gave a final piano lesson to Emily Crawford, the observant 8-year-old who had always sensed something unusual about her teacher, and waited for the agents to arrive. They came at dawn the next morning, 12 armed men who surrounded her townhouse as if she were a dangerous criminal rather than a 54-year-old piano teacher. Margaret invited them in, offered them coffee, and confirmed that yes, she had written the letter, and yes, she was prepared to cooperate fully. Her arrest made national headlines. The press called it one of the most significant counterintelligence breakthroughs of the Cold War, the exposure of a spy who had operated undetected for 2 decades at the heart of the nation's capital. Newspaper articles described Margaret as a master manipulator, a ruthless operative who had exploited innocent Americans to serve her Soviet masters. The characterization was not entirely inaccurate, but it was also not entirely complete. During her interrogation, which lasted for weeks, Margaret provided the FBI with detailed information about Soviet intelligence methods, handler protocols, communication systems, and recruitment techniques. She explained how she had built her network through human connection rather than ideology or money, how she had identified vulnerability and exploited trust. She held nothing back, answering every question with the same meticulous attention to detail she had once brought to her espionage work. When FBI interrogators asked her why she had confessed, Margaret struggled to articulate an answer that made sense even to herself. She talked about Hungary, about nuclear missiles, about seeing her life from the outside at her brother's funeral. But the real reason, she finally said, was simpler and more personal. She had spent 20 years lying to everyone, including herself, and she was tired of lying. She wanted, just once before she died, to tell the truth. Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell pleaded guilty to espionage charges in June 1958 and was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Several of her sources were also charged, though most received lighter sentences after cooperating with investigators. Thomas Brennan, the lonely stamp collector, died of a heart attack before his trial. Catherine Morrison divorced her husband and moved to California, where she lived under an assumed name. David Hoffman, the aerospace engineer, lost his security clearance and never worked in his field again, becoming instead a high school physics teacher in rural Pennsylvania. Margaret served 18 years in the federal women's prison in Alderson, West Virginia, before being released on parole in 1976 at age 72. She moved to a small apartment in Arlington, Virginia, and lived on a modest government pension, ironically paid by the same government she had betrayed. She never taught piano again, never spoke publicly about her espionage work, and never contacted any of the people she had recruited. She lived quietly and alone, reading library books and taking long walks, until she died of pneumonia in 1983 at age 79. The full extent of the damage Margaret's espionage caused remains classified to this day. Intelligence historians estimate that the information she provided to Soviet intelligence advanced their military technology by several years and compromised numerous American diplomatic and military operations. The human cost, the careers destroyed, and lives ruined by her betrayals cannot be quantified but was certainly substantial. What remains most troubling about Margaret Hartwell's story is not the simple fact of her betrayal, but the complex human truth it reveals about how idealism can curdle into manipulation, how conviction can excuse cruelty, and how someone can spend decades causing harm while believing they are serving a higher good. Margaret genuinely cared about the people she recruited even as she exploited them. She believed in the cause she served even as she came to doubt its justice. She was neither a cartoon villain nor a tragic hero, but something more uncomfortable, an ordinary person who made terrible choices for reasons that seemed compelling at the time. The piano that had once filled her Georgetown townhouse with music was sold at auction after her arrest. It was purchased by a young couple expecting their first child, who placed it in their living room and imagined the music their daughter might someday learn to play on it. They never knew that the piano had belonged to one of the Cold War's most successful spies, and that its keys had been touched by hands that had photographed classified documents and written intelligence reports that altered the balance of power between superpowers. It was just a piano, beautiful and silent, waiting for someone to bring it back to life. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.